Hey there, friends. Welcome to episode 210 of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today we are diving into one of my favourite topics. We're going to be talking all about perfectionism and the self-criticism that can come alongside that. So we're talking all about perfectionism today. And this is going to be sort of part of a two-part series around perfectionism and people-pleasing. And these are going to be topics that we continue to touch on fairly frequently. Not always talking about them with those terms, but if I was pressed to kind of come up with words to describe the type of people that I work with, perfectionism and people-pleasing would probably be three of those words. Because so often those things are what pull us into or drive us into or like make us feel kind of stuck in the self-criticism that they bring up. Now, before we dive into that too far, there is a huge amount of electric tools outside the window right now. Our across the road neighbours are doing some serious work over the road. So I can't wait for them to stop because I think it'll be going for days. So I apologise if you can hear that. So we're going to talk about perfectionism this week, people-pleasing next week, and we're going to just dive straight in. So when you think about perfectionism, I wonder what comes to mind. For me, I think of order and tidiness. And I know that if you're watching this on video, which some of you might be, most of you probably aren't, but behind me where I record is a bookshelf, and the books are all mostly color coordinated. Now that is very, very out of character for me. I did that during one of our lockdowns, but for the most part, I'm not a very tidy person. And so when I think of perfectionism, I think of physical order and tidiness and cleanliness and the perfectly curated home, the triple, quadruple checking of things to make sure they're just right, the self-care routine that is kind of stuck to a T. So it's this structure, this order is what I think of when I think of perfectionism. What do you think of? And I think that we all could shift our definition a little bit, because the truth is that yes, perfectionism can show up in these external ways, the order, the structure, the just so-ness of things, but you don't have to be a really tidy person to show and experience the impact of perfectionism. So I used to think there's no way I'm a perfectionist. My house is not tidy enough for that. The truth is that I have been a perfectionist a lot of the time through my life, but it shows up in a different way. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think probably a more clear way to think about perfectionism is to think about the impact on our self-talk, our self-perception, and like our perception of our own worth when things don't quite go to plan, when we don't quite live up to the expectations that we have for ourselves or the standards that we set for ourselves. So let's talk about definitions. I love to do a Google definition. And when you Google perfectionism, it tells you refusal to accept any standard short of perfection. And that's interesting, but here's the really interesting part. It then goes on to give us a little lesson in philosophy, which I love. So it has this little title that says philosophy, and then it says a doctrine holding that perfection is attainable, especially the theory that human moral or spiritual perfection should be or has been attained. I'm actually going to read that again. A doctrine holding that perfection is attainable, especially the theory that human moral or spiritual perfection should be or has been attained. So when we find ourselves slipping into perfectionism, what we're really doing is holding ourselves to a standard that we believe is or should be attainable. And when we look at it through this lens, what we realize is that doesn't leave any space for our human experience. It doesn't leave space for our humanity. Because humans are not going to get things perfect all the time. It's not a thing. It's not something that we can do. And so what I want to kind of like put out on the table in this episode is the possibility that by seeking perfection, we're actually chasing like the golden goose. We're chasing something that doesn't exist. We're chasing and then putting our worth on something that was never achievable in the first place. So I guess if we think about perfection from the point of view of like order, it's a little bit easier to see, right? Because we can be like, well, if everything has their place and everything's not in its place, then it's not perfect. If everything's in its place, then perfection has been achieved. But when we think about human behavior, which I think is where this gets a little bit more interesting, we simply cannot live up to our standards all of the time. And it's all pretty subjective, right? Something that we believe to be the right behavior, response, outcome might be somebody else's version of imperfection. And so it becomes a little bit messy. I want to give you a little bit of an example here. So last week was I had a really hard time last week. I had certain experiences that all led me to be very critical of myself last week. And I have a lot of tools that I use for that, and we're going to talk about some of them towards the end of this episode. And what I want to share with you is the reason that I bring this up is because part of our perfectionism can come in when we're also like, well, I shouldn't struggle with these things anymore, right? Like I shouldn't struggle with this human experience because I have all these tools and I should be getting it right by now. Again, probably very unrealistic expectation. We are human. Human life is messy, complicated, tricky, unpredictable, all of those things. And so perfectionism just cannot be our goal. Anyway, to come back, I did some stuff last week that I didn't love about myself. I didn't love that I said certain things, behaved in certain ways. When I say that, it makes it sound like it was really terrible. It wasn't at all, but just reflective of, so one of the examples is like saying something that you wish you hadn't said, right? So I sometimes have this tendency to have words pop out of my mouth before I really mean them. I'm a very kind person. I don't think I say mean things, but sometimes the things that I say, I'm like, that didn't come out the way that I intended, right? It didn't come out the way that I wanted it to come out. And what does that person think? How have they interpreted it? Blah, 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 blah. So I said something silly last week, and it was something that afterwards, when I thought about it, I was like, I wish I hadn't said that. I don't know how that was interpreted. Did I lose some sleep over it? Possibly a little. But that self-criticism, that sort of overthinking that we can do after we've behaved a certain way or said a certain thing or feel misunderstood can be really overwhelming. It can kind of stop us in our tracks. It can lead us into that feeling of like, oh my gosh, I'm spiraling into this pit of like, I can't get out of my own way, right? It can lead to a lot of self-doubt and self-contempt, and that can feel incredibly uncomfortable. So what's underpinning that, right? We've started this conversation off talking about perfectionism and how that can show up in the way that we talk to ourselves, the way that our self-criticism can come up. So when I had that moment of being like, I shouldn't have done that. I wish I hadn't said that. I wish I had said it a different way. I wish it had been interpreted differently, blah, 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 blah. The thing that underpinned that was a belief that I should have been capable of always communicating perfectly as a human. Is that possible? No. And so the philosophical sort of doctrine that underpins the criticism that then comes up is this belief that we should have been able to do better, and that we should always do better, and that we should always be able to live up to this standard that we have for our own behavior. That is hard, right? That is probably very much at odds with what it is to be human. Because as we just said before, being human is unpredictable, messy, complicated, all of those things. Perfectionism can also show up in our all or nothing ways of being. Like you're all in or you're all out. You're either at yoga every day or you're not doing it. You're either out for a walk every day or you're home. You're either all in or you're all out. And that also presupposes that there's one correct way of doing something, right? The right way is all in. The right way is to be giving it 100%. And if you're not doing that, then it must be wrong. it kind of almost lends itself to this concept of being good or being bad. And there's only one way to be good, and all the other ways are bad. And it tends to result in us kind of like throwing out all those other ways of being out the window, because they don't allow us to live up to that standard that we've set for ourselves that was already based on a false premise. So, what is a human to do? As I mentioned, I absolutely have perfectionist qualities, tendencies. They show up for me in my self-criticism. You should have done better. You could have done better. They're the main ones. It's probably that you should have done better comes up whenever I feel like I've let myself down or let somebody else down. What I want to offer up is three tips from movement, mindfulness, self-compassion practices that I think can be really helpful if you find yourself stuck in those loops of self-criticism because you've failed to be perfect. And I also want to, before we dive into those tips, I want to acknowledge that this desire to be perfect, it might not be the language that we're using, right? I wouldn't say that I have a desire to be perfect. It's at odds with my values. And yet it still will show up in the way that I speak to myself, in the way that I behave, in the way that I think about things. And it comes up in that language of like, should, I should have, I should do. It comes up in that language of like feeling as though you've missed the mark, right? And so being aware of how that can show up, even if we're not using the language of like, I try to be perfect all the time. I mean, I don't think anybody's walking around saying that, because we're also at the same time very aware of our imperfect nature. And so I think, and I hope that by kind of pointing out that the drive for perfectionism is kind of rooted in something that is false to begin with, the belief that there is something that equates to perfection, will hopefully loosen its pull a little bit so that we leave a little bit more space for our humanity. And these tips also speak to the fact that it's going to keep popping up, right? One of the things that can become tricky with our self-development practices, I suppose, this process of self-learning, self-discovery, growing, all of those things, is that we try to get it perfect. There's a real risk, and this is something that I've experienced over the 13 years that I've been teaching. There's a real risk that when you are like committed to doing that, that you then also hold yourself to a much higher standard than you might have before, because it's like, but I'm doing the work. So shouldn't I be better than this by now? And so I want to just like lay that out there. You can be doing this work, this introspection, this self-love and self-care work, and it will still come up and surprise you some days, maybe multiple times a day. And it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It's literally what it's like to be human. So with that in mind, here are my 3 tips. First one is to get clear on your values as being distinct from rules. So rules tell us what we must do. Rules tell us what we have to do in order to be worthy. I must get this right, otherwise I'm bad. I must get this perfect, otherwise nobody will love me. All of those sorts of things feel more like rules, right? Unless I get it perfect, unless this is the outcome, then I am crap, right? That's a rule. A value, though, is like a value of mine that I talk about all the time is kindness. Kindness towards myself, kindness towards other people. And I can be led by that value without it being a rule, because the value gives me space for my humanity. It gives me direction. You know, I want to move in the direction of kindness. And at the same time, it's not a rule. So if I don't move as clearly in that direction, it's not that I've failed. It's that I get to reset my course. It's that I get to think, well, what's my next action? What's my next step? I think a lot of us have rules around our own behavior, and we might also have rules around other people's behavior as well. But the only thing that we can control is, as you know, how we show up. And we have obviously got some control over that for sure, but there's also going to be things that are outside of our conscious awareness that are going to impact how we behave. So as an example of this, the other day, so one of the things that happened last week that kind of really threw me for a loop was that I called out in the middle of my basketball game. So I play basketball with a bunch of women, and I felt through this game that the refs' calls were really unfair. Now, it is a value of mine to be kind. It is a value of mine to be friendly. It's a big part of my identity, is being kind of friendly, being kind, being upbeat, all of those sorts of things. And I called out during the game about something that I felt was really unfair. I wasn't rude, but I was very direct. And I felt awful about it later. And it didn't, when I sort of repeated the story, I sort of obviously debriefed it with my husband and other people. And on the surface, it was totally benign, right? It was fine. It was no big deal. What's the issue? But to me, it filled me with a sense of you didn't live up to your own standards. And so I felt that as a sense of shame. That's how it felt in my body. And it was me trying to live up to a rule of you will never behave like XYZ. How unrealistic is that? When I actually kind of picked it apart a little bit, because I overthought it without a doubt, but when I picked it apart, I recognized that I felt threatened by the process. I felt threatened. I felt a sense of injustice. I felt like things weren't fair. And our human brains have this way of using information that we are not necessarily consciously aware of in the moment to make decisions, right? To create outputs. And so I had a moment of my mouth moving before my brain had a chance to think it through. And that is part of what it is to be human sometimes, because I reacted from a place that wasn't fully conscious. And this is a pretty benign example. I've given examples from the basketball court before. I think it's a really interesting environment, the sporting arena, because you're kind of in this fight or flight zone, but you also have the potential to be very socially connected, maybe. Or if you don't feel like things are fair, you have the risk of going into a less connected version of fight or flight that makes you a little bit more feeling like you're at odds, right? And so we will sometimes behave in ways that are driven by something that we're not conscious of. And that's not to excuse, unkind, aggressive behavior. Absolutely not. But I think it also opens the door to more self-compassion. So getting clear on your values is really important, not just because, I should say, it gives you a standard for behavior, but it also allows you to do that in a way that is not rule driven. So I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to loop back to that in a second, because the second point is to practice self-compassion. Self-compassion looks like acknowledging that you're suffering, right? So in this moment where you've had this situation where you're like, well, I screwed up. I didn't I didn't live up to my perfectionism, even though you're probably not using those terms. I didn't live up to the standard of behavior or the standard of outcome that I wanted. And I am now suffering as a result. I am suffering with my own self-criticism. I'm suffering with the shame, the guilt, whatever it might be. Self-compassion is acknowledging that. It's not trying to make it go away. It's not trying to squish it. It's saying, I am having a moment of suffering. And this moment of suffering is something that is part of being human. And in the midst of my suffering, I am worthy of my own kindness. I am worthy of my own recognition. And it can be a moment too of acknowledging that, you know what, I'm trying my best. I'm doing my darndest. And being imperfect is part of being human. And it's offering yourself kindness even in the midst of that. And I think that also opens up space for us to then loop around back to that first point of be guided more by your values than your rules. And to be okay, how do I now move in line with my values and recognize that part of the reason that I'm suffering is because I'm holding myself to standards that are driven by rules and by a doctrine that says perfectionism is possible or perfect is possible. Yeah. And then the third point is to practice the space that exists between all and nothing through your self-care practices. You can practice this anywhere, but I think that self-care practices are a really great way to do it, because it also then gives you the space to practice self-care, even in the smallest amounts. At the beginning, we sort of talked about, all or nothing thinking being part of perfectionism. And it's like, well, I'm either doing the 60-minute yoga class X number of times a week, or I'm not doing anything at all. One of the things that I love to do inside the SelfKind Hub when members join is we've got a lot of classes we've got classes that range from 5 minutes all the way up to 60. And sometimes people will say, oh, I never do the 60-minute ones because they're too long. And I said, well, what would happen if you just put it on for half an hour and then you turned it off? And we don't like that, right? It's like, that doesn't sound right. I don't think that I would be doing it right if I only did half an hour. And I always encourage them, if they're willing and if it doesn't feel too deeply uncomfortable, to just try. Put on the hour-long class and stop it when you need to. Stop it after 20 minutes. Stop it after 30 minutes. Not with the expectation that you're just going to trick yourself into doing 60. I mean, you might, but the truth is that you get to decide what is enough. And it's not based on purely the rules that you've presupposed exist about what self-care looks like and what it has to look like in order to be worthy and valid. 5 minutes counts. The enoughness of something is not based on those external rules. It is a whole combination of factors, including what is the reality of what your life looks like right now and feels like. If you don't feel like you have the time, I believe you. Life is busy. Life is full. So how can you make decisions about what is enough for you right now based on those realities, right? And practice the all or nothing in between in that context. The 5 minutes, once a week instead of 5 times a week, the 5 minutes today, 45 minutes tomorrow. Practice it in that zone of your life and see how it feels. This perfectionism stuff leaves clues in our bodies. We feel it, right? We feel the impact of that drive towards something that is actually unachievable. It feels uncomfortable. And what exactly that feels like will be unique to each of us, but I invite you to be paying attention, right? Because sometimes we will do these things, often we will do these things without the conscious awareness of what we're doing. We just do them because it's what we do. And so as we become more aware of it, we can use the signals that our body brings up, right? Those feelings and those sensations, the emotions as well, to give us clues of like, oh, where am I perhaps driving myself with rules rather than values? Where am I perhaps holding a standard for myself that doesn't serve me right now? And how can I then choose to move differently, respond differently, in line with my values, in line with a recognition that humanity is, by its very nature, imperfect. All right, so I'm going to just do top line, those 3 tips again. Get clear on your values as distinct from rules, practice self-compassion, and then practice that space that exists between all and nothing in your self-care practices. Come and share with me what you take away from this episode. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what perfectionism can be and how it can feel and what it can show up like. I have notes in front of me, and one of the things that I didn't write down was that story about basketball. And so I recognize that in sharing it, my thoughts were not as cohesive as I would have liked. And the perfectionist tendency in me is going, let's listen back to all of this and see if we should re-record it. And I'm not going to do that. I am going to listen back to it because that's part of my editing process, but I'm not going to re-record it because this is what it is to be human. Now, that's not to say that I don't sometimes re-record things. I do. but also getting clear on our whys when we do things like that. It is sometimes so uncomfortable facing our humanity. It really is. Some days it feels really easy. Some days it's like, what is this? Why? Why is this so deeply uncomfortable all the time? And if nothing else from this podcast has landed, from this episode, I truly hope, and I have no control over this, but I truly hope that in hearing me talk about the discomfort of that humanity, it gives you a little bit more space for yours. Space to meet yourself with that compassion, space to meet yourself with an understanding that it's not just you who feels like sometimes you're getting this human thing wrong. It's complicated, and we do so much, we give ourselves so much, what's the word I want to use? We hold space for ourselves in a way that's very different when we acknowledge that to be true and when we share it, right? We don't have to share all the gritty bits with everybody, of course, but there is a deep sense of okayness, I think, that comes with sharing our humanity and recognizing that we're not alone in the way that we feel. So I'm going to leave it at that. As I said, next week we're going to dive into people pleasing, which is not dissimilar actually to perfectionism. They are definitely siblings. We're going to dive into that. So stay tuned for that next week. In the meantime, come and share with me, takeaways, thoughts, ideas, questions. You'll find me over on Instagram at Erica Webb _SelfKind. If you haven't yet subscribed to my email list as well, I'll pop I'll pop a link for that in the show notes. And you'll find it on my website as well, ericawebb.com.au. That is where you'll get reminders about the podcast. That is where you'll get extra, weekly inspiration. So if you haven't joined that yet, I would suggest, if you feel like it, go on over and sign up for that as well. All right, until next week, friends, keep being kind, keep making space for that beautiful humanity of yours, and I will see you soon.